The Dark Knight Rises came out in 2012 and was the conclusion to Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy. This film picks up 8 years since the Batman was last seen, and all this time Bruce Wayne has been in hiding, after taking the fall for Harvey Dent's actions at the end of The Dark Knight. But he's forced to wear the cape one last time when Bane, his most physically challenging and relentless opponent yet, arises from the shadows to take over Gotham City. I'm just gonna get this out of the way. I do think that The Dark Knight Rises is the weakest out of the trilogy. I also think that it's one of Christopher Nolan's weaker films. Now, that being said, I still like this film a lot. It's just that I think it has some more noticeable problems, and I'd like to discuss some of those. In my review for The Dark Knight, I mentioned that that film had a few issues that I was easily able to look past because they're so minor, especially compared to everything else on display. In the case of this film, it makes a lot of those same mistakes that The Dark Knight had, but times 11. There's quite a few continuity errors, especially during fight scenes, and others that are just really glaring. For instance, in the first half of the film, there's a chase scene that clearly begins during the daytime. They go into a tunnel, and suddenly it's nighttime, all in the span of like 10 minutes. These kind of things wouldn't usually bother me that much, and I understand that these things can happen, especially with such a big production, but there's a lot of it. It also has a lot of plot holes and just silly plot elements. It's established at a certain point that no one can get in or out of the city, yet someone does, but it's not explained to us how he could have done this, especially under the extreme circumstances. At another point, Gotham's entire police force are trapped in the sewers. But why'd they send every cop in the city down there in the first place? Bad idea. I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that the script just wasn't as tight as it could have been, because at times it also has some pretty weak dialogue. There's a romance that feels quite forced. I mean, you later understand one of the characters' motivations, but it still doesn't make sense for the other. Speaking of characters, this film introduced a bunch of new members to its cast, and I'll talk about the rest in a moment, but there's one in particular, played by Marion, who I think is a wonderful actress. She's great in Inception, and she's fine here until a certain point in which there's a drastic change in her character. And personally, from there, her performance just didn't work for me. One last thing I'd like to mention in regards to negatives is the sound mixing, because in some instances it'll be soft to the point that it's hard to understand what the characters are saying, and in others it'll be very loud. The most extreme example would be Bane's voice, which I get is supposed to be ominous, but it often sounds quite unnatural and like it isn't part of his surroundings. Now, hearing all that, you might get the impression that I hate this movie, when really the opposite is true. I think there's still a lot to appreciate. For starters, once again, Hans Zimmer's score is incredible, and fits perfectly to the more somber tone that they were going for. And just like The Dark Knight, this film is absolutely grandiose in scale. The IMAX sequences look gorgeous, there are plenty of impressive scenes, again done in camera with a mix of practical and miniature sets. Bane's introduction in the opening plane sequence being a standout, it's very well done and sets up this unavoidable danger to come. The final battle in the snow is so epic it gives me chills. The amount of extras they got is insane. Let's talk about some of those new cast members. I love Tom Hardy as Bane. His character isn't as interesting as the Joker, but that's an unfair comparison anyway. He's so intimidating and ferocious. Like I mentioned in the beginning, he's basically the first character in this series who's been able to challenge Batman strength-wise. There are so many points in the film in which he gives off this sense of hopelessness for our heroes. Tom Hardy is great at emoting so much through his eyes, and I also like how he uses his voice despite the distracting sound mixing. Anne Hathaway as Catwoman walks the line of being super badass and sexy very well. I like her banter with Batman, and she's got some great fight scenes. Joseph Gordon-Levitt, another cast member from Inception, I think adds a lot to the story, because a lot of the time you've got this very somber and hopeless tone, and a lot of the characters reflect that. But Joseph Gordon-Levitt plays this cop who, despite what's been said, still believes in Batman. He isn't afraid to stand up for what he believes is right, even when the people of Gotham begin to lose their faith. and therefore I thought his character brought a lot of heart to this film. Michael Caine isn't in this movie a lot, but the scenes in which he is in, he's fantastic. He has some very heartfelt moments with Bruce that are quite emotional. Gary Oldman again gets a lot to do as Commissioner Gordon. You can tell that this lie he's been forced to keep from the end of the last movie is just eating him up inside with guilt, as Batman is essentially seen as a villain in the eyes of the public, and I thought that inner conflict that he has was very well explored. Christian Bale, like the previous films, is excellent at embodying both Bruce Wayne and Batman. When we see him at the beginning, he's a very broken man. He isn't as strong as he used to be. The symbol that Batman once stood for is no longer there, and so he has to go on this arc to becoming Batman again. And it is very compelling. In fact, I'd say that's this film's biggest strength, actually making you care about these characters. Like I said, definitely think this one's the weakest, but it's still really good, despite its flaws. And for a film that's close to 3 hours, I'm never bored watching it, which is impressive. I'm going to give The Dark Knight Rises a B+. Personally, this film closes out one of my favorite trilogies of all time. If you for some reason have never seen these films, highly recommend it. I appreciate you guys for stopping by. Until next time, thanks for watching.